It was very common for wrestlers in the early to late 80s to be larger than life. 24-inch biceps and chest that you could park a car on was regular in wrestling at the time. In 1984, we saw the birth of the Hulkamania era, which took wrestling to be on a more popular level and even tied wrestling in with pop culture. The brains behind this phenomenon had not just been headed by any person. It was the ideology most headed by Vincent Kennedy McMahon. He envisaged wrestling to be a spectacle, and with that, instead of creating real wrestlers in the sense of professional mat wrestlers, he wanted to create superstars. You could even say that the wrestlers at the time, including Jim Hellwig, i.e. the Ultimate Warrior, and Macho Man Randy Savage, were portrayed as live-action cartoon characters with their enormous physiques. Well, how did they accomplish and maintain such big bodies? Well, for certain, none of them actually woke up with that kind of body. Most had trained for years with the right regimen of bodybuilding. Unfortunately for some, others would have to actually rely on the help of enhancement drugs such as anabolic steroids and other such human growth hormones to build bigger and better bodies. Surely the WWF was aware of this, as it was seen in high-profile sports such as the NFL and even the Olympics, where it would not only eliminate fair competition, but protect the athlete. The WWF had only introduced a wellness policy in 1987, but the policy was not there to protect wrestlers from using enhancement drugs. It was for those using recreational drugs such as marijuana and cocaine, as it stemmed from the controversy involving both the Iron Sheik and Jim Duggan, where both had been pulled over by the police with a suspected DUI, but when pulled over, not only did they discover that they had been driving under the influence of alcohol, but also marijuana and cocaine. The arrest had actually broken down the barriers of kayfabe, as the wrestling community had discovered that they had been travelling together when there had also been an existing feud on screen. Because of this, Vince was outraged due to the media coverage and proceeded to fire both of them and introduce a drug testing policy. It seemed in fact that the WWF officials and Vince McMahon were more concerned with kayfabe rather than the wellness of their wrestlers, which was the main reason for their punishment. Regardless of the policy, wrestlers continued to obtain anabolic steroids and use them. Better yet, the question still remained as to how wrestlers were able to obtain such performance-enhancing drugs. Enter Dr. George Zahorian, a physician who was appointed by the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission to attend WWF cards in the mid-80s. He was also even involved in some of the TV angles. He was able to distribute the steroids to many of the talent at the time. Distribution of any steroids without a medical purpose had been made illegal since the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 1988. It seemed well known in the company at the time that he had been handing steroids to the wrestlers and continued to be employed, even though the act was in place. Even Vince McMahon himself revealed in July 1991 that he also purchased steroids through Zahorian in 1987. Due to his bad reputation and illegal activity, a Titan Sports employee, Anita Scales, recommended that Zahorian should be removed from the WWF. She even noted this to Linda McMahon and Pat Patterson, but they both ignored her, as Patterson even remarked the wrestlers need their quote-unquote candy. However, in late 1989, Linda McMahon and Patterson would both change their tune, as somehow they had received a tip-off into a federal investigation into Zahorian's affairs. Linda McMahon even in fact sent a memo to Pat Patterson with concern. It read, "I spoke to Vince about the fact that the state of Pennsylvania is probably going to launch an investigation into the use of all illegal drugs including steroids. An officer from the State Department mentioned that Jack Krill, one of our attorneys, at a recent fundraiser that his office would be conducting these investigations. He told Krill that perhaps it was a bad idea to mention it to him because Krill's firm represents the WWF. In addition, this fellow mentioned that he was aware of Dr. Zahorian and his relationship with the WWF. Although you and I had discussed before about continuing to have Zahorian at our events as the doctor on call, I think that is now not a good idea. Vince agreed, and I would like for you to call Zahorian to tell him not to come to any more of our events and to also clue him on any action that the Justice Department is thinking of taking. On December 26th, the State Athletic Commission is having a small meet and a greet session with some of our talent, and I would definitely not want Zahorian there. Please be in touch with me and I'll replay all the details to you." Linda McMahon had commented in 2010 that the tip-off had actually come from James West, the man who would actually prosecute Dr. Zahorian. West denied this as he stated that he never attended any fundraiser, and as a prosecutor he would have been automatically barred from attending it. So information surrounding how Linda McMahon would have actually known about the tip-off is sketchy, as they both contradict each other. What was surely known was Patterson informing Zahorian by a payphone that he will be investigated, and told it may only be a minor investigation. Under oath, Zahorian told of how Patterson wanted to carry on business with him after the investigation, and to destroy all information he held regarding any WWF wrestlers. Things would later get worse for Zahorian, as one of his former customers, ex-powerlifter William Dunn, agreed to wear a wire for the FBI to gather evidence as part of a plea bargain. On the 27th of May 1990, Dunn had attended Zahorian's office and purchased $650 of worth of illegal substances, and managed to record the following transcript. "I take care of 4 or 5 wrestlers and that's it. I don't need the aggravation because it's too dangerous. It's like I told you, cash and carry. I want you to know they're watching. These guys are bastards." The tip-off was successful, and the FBI managed to raid Zahorian's office to discover him shredding documents relating to the dealings he had with certain WWF wrestlers. These included Rowdy Piper, Alfred Hayes, and Mike Rotunda, otherwise known as IRS. With that evidence, Zahorian would be indicted in February 1991. The indictment had 15 counts, which included the distribution of steroids to 5 wrestlers. Number 1, Richard Venault, also known as Rick Martel. Number 2, Brian Blair, one of the Killer Bees. Number 3, Dan Spivey. Number 4, Roderick Toombs, aka Rowdy Piper. And number 5, John H. Doe, an alias to protect none other than Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan. All 4 wrestlers admitted under oath that they had purchased steroids from Zahorian. The 5th and final wrestler hadn't actually been revealed due to private and personal matters that should be protected. This meant that the WWF was able to stop Hulk Hogan from giving a statement. But this didn't mean that the other testimonies given by the other 4 wrestlers hadn't been damaging enough. Zahorian relied on the fact that he did not know the law had changed, and that he was ultimately protecting the wrestlers from purchasing steroids from the black market. The defense was ultimately refuted, as ignorance of the law was no defense. He was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and fined $12,700 on the 27th of December 1991. But did this mean that Vince and Hogan were let off? Many seemed dismayed at the fact that Hogan never had to testify. Before Zahorian was sentenced, Hogan instead attended the Arsenio Hall show in July 1991 to discuss the issue. He stated,
I've trained 20 years, 2 hours a day to look like I do. But the things that I am not is I'm not a steroid abuser, and I do not use steroids.
Liar! After Hogan's false statement, many wrestlers came out of the woodwork on a show called Inside Edition to disprove him. Superstar Billy Graham told of how he personally injected Hogan with steroids, and Dave Schultz also remarked that Hogan had given him a temporary home and looked after him, and in return asked Schultz how to use steroids. Hogan had no choice but to reveal that the statement he made was false, and told how he used steroids on 3 occasions, one for an injury and twice with doctor supervision. The WWF also realized they would be digging a deeper hole by being lenient with their policy, and would have to toughen it straight away. So within the same month, they announced that they would be testing for anabolic steroids, and that the following punishments would occur if the test was failed. Number 1, a 6-week suspension for the first failure. Number 2, a second 6-week suspension and mandatory rehab. Number 3, termination. Of course, this policy was only subject to performers. This didn't turn away the fact that the WWF was still parceling drugs in and out of the company, with the exception of a few hotels in the same cities where wrestlers were performing at, and the purpose of supersizing his employees had put McMahon back into the spotlight of this trial. On the 18th of November 1993, Vince McMahon was indicted by the US Department of Justice on 2 counts of illegal activity relating to anabolic steroids between 1985 to 1991. Including the distribution of steroids and conspiracy. Vince's chances of being acquitted going into the trial were somewhat quite weak, as most high-ranking WWF officials knew that Dr. Zahorian had been giving the wrestlers steroids. Again, Vince relied on the fact that if Zahorian was unable to provide the drug, they would alternatively purchase unsafe anabolic steroids from the black market and inject unsafe quantities into their system. McMahon also tried to acknowledge that pro wrestling should be regarded as entertainment as opposed to a bona fide contest. McMahon's defense and chances of being acquitted were soon diminishing after Zahorian testified and told the courts that 98 to 99% of the drugs sold were to wrestlers and people in the WWF head office. Vince's attorney Jerry McDevitt denied the percentage and thought that most of the WWF head office composed more of ex-athletes and trainers. In order to prove distribution, the prosecution was able to rely on a bank check in the amount of $538 payable to Dr. Zahorian on the 28th of October 1989. This could have been used to distribute steroids to the performers. Zahorian had mentioned in his testimony that he had sent McMahon 12 vials of decadurablin, a couple of bottles of testosterone, and a few bottles of human growth hormones, which seemed to be enough for 7 or 8 cycles. This was important as the amount showed that there was a chance that Vince was distributing them to other wrestlers. Things looked up for Vince, however, as Zahorian told of how he distributed steroids to both Arnold Skolland and Chief Jay Strongbow. They instead gave it to their sons, and this proved that Vince nor Titan Sports pushed to give their wrestlers steroids. Furthermore, Arnold's son, George, was a jobber, and as jobbers did not help sell tickets or merchandise, Titan Sports or McMahon could not be held guilty of conspiracy. The defense also relied again on Zahorian's testimony, where he mentioned that Hogan requested 3 or 4 bottles of testosterone to give to Tiny Lister, aka Zeus. The package was instead sent to Atlanta, where they filmed No Holds Barred. So if anyone was doing the distributing, it was Hogan and not Vince. They also mentioned that other top stars such as Bob Backlund, Sergeant Slaughter and George Steele were more dependent on their characters rather than their bodies. Hogan, who was a key element surrounding this trial, also mentioned that he never purchased them through Vince, nor did Vince ever encourage him to buy them, and none of the wrestlers had told of Vince wanting them to purchase steroid to boost his own business, as wrestlers purchased them strictly on their own accord. The only person to actually testify against Vince was Kevin Waholtz, aka Nails. He said that Vince actually wanted him to purchase steroids. Unfortunately, his credibility of evidence had been called into question, as he stated he hated McMahon. So what was the verdict? Was Vince found guilty of the 2 counts? If he did, he was facing up to 8 years imprisonment and fined $500,000. Of course, many of us know that Vince was never convicted. But why? Ultimately, the prosecution never succeeded in directly attaching McMahon to distributing the steroids to his wrestlers. In the absence of such evidence, the conspiracy allegations fell apart and Vince was acquitted of all charges. But what if Vince was actually convicted of the steroid trial? How could this have changed the WWF? Well, the plan is, if Vince was convicted and was forced to step down as chairman of the WWF, they would have had promoter Jerry Jarrett to come in and take Vince's position. This change seems very strange, as both Vince and Jerry Jarrett have 2 contrasting styles of what wrestling is. Vince envisages wrestling to be a spectacle rather than a sport, which contradicts Jerry Jarrett's ideology of wrestling as a whole. It's very clear to say though that wrestling would have almost certainly been different if it were not for Vince. Would we have ever got so far as the Attitude Era? Whether you think that this would have actually changed the business or not, you cannot deny that Vince McMahon has made a huge imprint on the wrestling world and continues to do so to this day. Things would certainly not have been the same without him. Well guys, this about wraps up the first episode of Behind the Titantron. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you can like, comment and subscribe and check out more of my other videos. For now, this is Wrestlelamia signing out, and I'll see you next time for some more wrestling content.